you go past any kind of five-a-side football cage in the UK, like 10, 20 years ago, it would have been all the big clubs you'd expect. And now you'll see niche ones. People want to be asked about their shirt. What's that team? Where did you get that from? I think that's a real motivation for a lot of people now, including me. It's cool. I like it. Got my Goa FC shirt. Wear that in the gym. Why not?
Hello and welcome to Outlines, a podcast about sport, stories and the media. My name's Owen Connolly, hope you're well. It is great to have you listening. Funny question, have you seen a football shirt today? I'm guessing yes. Maybe on the street or on a screen, you might be wearing one right now. Don't feel like you have to write in on that. Football shirts are ubiquitous, and while they've always been powerful signifiers of allegiance, they now have much deeper symbolic importance when it comes to the story of sport. That is the thesis of More Than a Shirt, How Football Shirts Explain Global Politics, Money and Power, an excellent book released over the summer by Joey D'Urso, senior data journalist at The Times and Sunday Times. Joey alights on a series of examples of shirts whose particular characteristics, colour schemes, sponsors' logos, or in one case, the face of a late Colombian drug kingpin, are threads that tangle into a dense network of cultural, historical and commercial factors. Looked at this way, football shirts can tell us about the geopolitical conditions that brought war back to Europe, the soft power bases being built by Gulf states, the ghostly movements of betting and crypto companies through international markets, the unexpected connections between communities on opposite sides of the planet, and much more. I spoke to Joey about how he developed this framing for a recent history of football, his selection of shirts and storylines, and what he thinks the football shirt can tell us about where the game's going next. He also talks a bit about his wider career, which has taken in stints at The Athletic and as a political reporter for the BBC, and he shares a piece of data that may just carry a seed of optimism for British sport and society. That's all to come. As ever, if you're enjoying the podcast, whatever you can do to get the word out about it will be much appreciated. Subscribe, share, rate, review, get involved on socials, all that kind of stuff. But above all, just sit back and listen. Some fascinating details ahead in this chat. Here is Joey D'Urso. I mean, it sounds like an obvious, even slightly corny thing to ask, but are you still a buyer of or wearer of football shirts yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. When I travel the world and I've been to all sorts of obscure places, I'll often grab one on the way. I've got a drawer full of shirts from India, from Colombia, from the places I went to in my book. I've kind of fallen out with buying, like the latest Villa shirt, like I might once have done. It costs like £100 and it's some obscure gambling company and I'm just not really into that. But on my travels, certainly love it.
Yeah. Your association with shirts, I think, as a fan, is quite post hoc.
Yeah, whether the season was a good one or not.
That along with the sheer cost of it is quite hard to justify. But when you're a grown man, other responsibilities,
I shouldn't. But when you see someone in his 40s wearing the signing that was signed last week on his back of his shirt, I do slightly judge that, but I shouldn't, because that's these are the kind of people who might buy my book.
Exactly. It's all degrees, right?
Yeah, there's much worse things you could be doing with your money.
But as we may get to, but why football shirts? What was it that kind of led you to that framing as for this particular look at football? I
mean, I've always loved football. I've always loved football shirts, as have a large percentage of the men in this country. But I work at The Athletic. I no longer work there. I work at The Times and the Sunday Times now. But the sort of two biggest things I worked on at The Athletic that I'm proudest of were investigations into Asian gambling sponsors, very murky and shady people pouring money into Premier League clubs through gambling in Southeast Asia, marketing to Chinese gamblers. And I did some big investigations into that. And also cryptocurrency, crypto sponsors, which advertise through football shirts and football more broadly. And then a sort of year or so later, I had the idea or spoke to an agent about a book about football, about the work I've been doing. And I thought the football shirt was something much bigger than just the work that I'd done, but was also this huge, the politics of the Middle East, the politics of oil, the politics of all sorts of things can be told through the humble football shirt. So I use it as a device.
Yeah, and had you settled on the path that you wanted to take through the recent history of football before you'd settled on the shirts, if you see what I mean?
There's a bit of there's got to be a bit of sort of flexibility with these things, and these things certainly changed a bit from the initial pitch. Some of them was based on places I'd already been to, with the Athletic, and they funded those trips thanks to them to places like Qatar and India. Some of them I did off my own bat. I went to Colombia in the US, just completely off my own bat. And then there's a bit, I went to a friend's wedding in South Africa, and while I was there, I was like, oh, I'll find a football shirt, which was not hard at all. There's an incredible football story in South Africa. So there was a bit of like, you sometimes meet people like, oh, you should have gone to, I don't know, Australia. And it's like, well, if you pay for my flight, I'd love to go to Australia, so there has to be a bit of, flexibility and pragmatism thrown in. And obviously there's a, which I say in the intro, like there's a bit of a bias towards England, towards Europe, because that's where I live. That's where I know the best. But also because that is the sort of centre of world football, right? So, there is less, but I've tried as hard as possible to, been to 5 different continents. I've been pretty global, hopefully, in my approach. And it was fun.
Yeah. And other than that sort of, pattern of logistics and happenstance, what was it that led you to the shirts that you chose? What was the, was there a kind of thesis that you had in mind?
Yeah. I mean, the basic thesis is that football shirts explain the world. And if you take any big global topic, you can find a football shirt to tell that story. And some of them are pretty, you'd be mad to write a book like this without talking about Qatar and Saudi Arabia and PSG and Newcastle. That's all in there. But, as sort of one thing among many. What I also really wanted to do and try quite hard to do was to find some more obscure stories to hopefully make people sit up and go, oh, I didn't know that. Like the tale of sort of Pablo Escobar and the drug cartels and how that's told through a football shirt, or Russia's war in Ukraine and Gazprom and how that's told through a football shirt. So I tried to mix the maybe more obvious stuff that I had to include with stuff that's a bit more niche.
Yeah, and of the stuff that you did explore, what was there anything that particularly surprised you? And you, as you say, a lot of this has grown out of your own work.
I think just the sheer penetration of like top European clubs football shirts everywhere. And I think people kind of already knew this, but I think it's in a very different place to how it was 10 years ago. 20 years ago. I remember having a really interesting conversation with some people in Mumbai, Reliance Industries, who own the IPL team there, one of the biggest companies in India. And they were basically saying, and football in India is not high quality compared to most of the world, but they're really optimistic about the next 20 or 30 years. But they say, the Indian national team is not very good because these days you have to get a player when they're like 6 or 7. You can't get them when they're 14 because they'll never be good enough. But they basically said that in India, like mobile internet means people are watching Premier League highlights who don't even have like running water at home or whatever. And the cost is so low on these basic Android smartphones that like the number of people following football is just growing so quickly in the space of like 5-10 years. And these people in rural China, rural India, rural Africa are glued to the Premier League. And we haven't quite seen that effect come through yet. But it's what the numbers are wild.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting dichotomy, isn't it? Because you think of football shirts as having originated and, still serve as like an emblem of a local community and an emblem of the kind of background from which a team might have arisen. If you think about, I'm trying to think, I'm sure there's a partner team with Aston Villa where the claret and blue comes from. Is there a story with Villa and West Ham?
I think
something
Burnley
like that with that shit.
Copied
Burnley,
possibly West Ham.
But
there'll be some team in South America. Juventus was copied off Notts County.
And then there's always stories kind of from the early football league days of like a team donated a bag of their old shirts to another club, and that's why these two clubs have very similar identities. But then at the same time, it's become this like emblem of the globalization of media and culture that. As we'll get onto, I'm sure you've got Messi and Ronaldo shirts, both real and counterfeit, on the backs of kind of 8-year-old kids in parks around the world, and clubs that have almost no foothold in different places, popping up in their colours popping up all over the shop, and as you say, that the Premier League's kind of hegemony in lots of different sports cultures as well. I mean, how much was that duality something that you kind of
Well,
you
it makes
came
me think to a
across?
couple of conversations I had in South Africa where I tried to talk to locals about the Orlando Pirates and the Kaiser Chiefs and they just kind of weren't that interested. They want to talk about Ruben Amorim, and Arne Slot, and obviously that's not everyone in South Africa, but I think a lot of the domestic league there is the quality is not very good on objective metrics of whatever, and people would rather watch really high quality stuff on TV. And there are still some really well supported teams there, but it's certainly bigger watching Premier League games on TV than watching the national leagues, which is kind of a blessing and a curse, right? I mean, I think, but in lots of countries, the domestic league isn't that good. And part of the reason for that is that football is so much more globalized now that the best players won't stay there very long.
Yeah, yeah. Something that you talked a lot about in the book, and that you've obviously it's a little bit of the root of the story and a lot of your work in The Athletic, as you say, is branding and sponsors on shirts. Which is a stark change over the last 40 years. If you're thinking about them as like a cultural artifact, that's the thing that's most different. And actually, it kind of creates these generations of difference within the last 40 years, because you have these different brands and you have different categories of product and sponsor and all the rest of it. How fundamental do you think that is now to the perception of football shirts, and football shirts in particular? It feels like, because there is branding in other sports, but not in the NFL, not in the NBA to the same extent.
Yeah, I think lots of people are very nostalgic about the shirts of their youth. That's a huge thing, and you'll see that. It's just fun. Like, the weather's turned a bit in the last week or two, but in summer, I really noticed it this summer. Just like retro football shirts everywhere, and often like a lot of women, like a lot of different ages, young kids wearing shirts from clearly 20 years before they were born. It's just such a big part of like fashion, of culture now. And I think also there's a bit of a yearning for sponsors that are a bit more cuddly and a bit more, I wrote a book about one of my favourite shirts as a Villa fan is when it was sponsored by Acorns, which is a children's hospice, which these days, that's not doing anything for your FFP and your PSR, being sponsored or carrying the logo of a hospice for free. So I think, there's a bit of nostalgia for the time when a lot more sponsors were a bit closer to home, a bit more even just, there's a lot of Japanese electronics companies in the 90s, JVC at Arsenal, Sharp at Manchester United, Brother at Manchester City. That's sort of a real, a hi-fi in your house or a telly. It's a bit more real than these sort of amorphous financial companies that sponsor clubs now.
But what does that do, or how conscious were some of the people you spoke to about the power that brand on the front of the shirt has, or that association has?
Do you mean fans, or do you mean?
Well, let's kind of, it's one you can split out, right? Because fans will, as you say, they'll have an emotional association with different eras or with seasons that have gone particularly well. One of the stories that you tell in the first chapter of the book, which is about the Schalke shirt and the Gazprom logo, is of these specially created blue stickers in the right shade of blue that go over the Gazprom logo after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But then you also have, the club are aware that they're selling something, and then the sponsors are aware that they are buying into something that's quite kind of culturally potent. How much is that a part of the story of not just the football shirt, but also what that has become in the last kind of 15 years that you went into?
Oh, so it's a massive part of the story. And I think fundamentally, particularly if you're sponsoring one of the biggest clubs in the world, you'll have people, I saw them walking around in a slum in Colombia or on a beach in India or on a shopping mall in Texas. And there's kind of nothing that really can replicate that. I mean, that doesn't automatically mean it's value for money. I think you can just instantly turn a brand global through sponsoring a football club like that. And there's no real parallel for that.
Yeah. There's a few big nation state stories that, just while we're on this topic of branding, that become really significant to that relationship between, a shirt of another culture or of another country, or of that carries a message much further and wider than it would have done. The Schalke one, as we talked about, the Qatar Foundation, latterly Qatar Airways story with Barcelona, and the relationship that Newcastle United now have with Saudi Arabia. Was there a through line that you found between those stories beyond that kind of simple amplification of a message, or that simple kind of building of presence in different territories and different contexts? Was there an evolution of the idea of what this could accomplish, this relationship with a club in that way?
Well, I think just the obvious thing that they're advertising nation states. It's literally the reason the Qatar Foundation, the Qatar Airways sponsored Barcelona was because people walking around with Qatar on their front, and a lot of people, certainly before 2010, hadn't heard of Qatar. And the sort of 1-2 attack of Barcelona shirts, sort of PSG in a slightly more indirect way, and then the World Cup means Qatar is now massively known to people, not just to football fans and to whatever else. I mean, a more subtle one is Emirates, of course. Sponsor, Arsenal, Real Madrid, AC Milan. I think the Real Madrid Emirates thing kind of goes under the radar. The fact that by far the most successful team in the world in the last 15 years has just had this big advert for the state of the UAE all over its shirts, everywhere, and it's become this. But because it hasn't owned a club in the sense of Qatar or Abu Dhabi, it goes under the radar a bit. But yeah, I think a lot of it is just the very simple thing of getting your country's name out there. And there's been some more niche examples of that. There was Azerbaijan with Atletico Madrid.
Yeah, I remember that one. Yeah,
Congo sponsored someone recently. I can't remember who it is.
Yeah,
somewhere abroad. Yeah, Rwanda, of course.
Rwanda. Yeah, I mean that's actually that's another element of it, isn't it? Is that it's a softening, or it's a dicing up, or what's the word I'm looking for? I know we brought Escobar into the conversation. I'm trying not to think of cutting, but like
sanitizing.
Sanitizing, but it's also it's just presenting something in a different context. I think that's a useful means for those brands to execute in the first place, whether that's a flag carrying airline or what have you, or some of the, was it Land of Fire was the Baku slogan that appeared on the Atletico shirts, whereas just Azerbaijan might have made people reach for their newspapers a little bit more quickly. But that combination again of a subtler brand story or a more palatable brand story and the context of football shirts has been something that's been recurring in that respect.
Yeah, and it's just associating it with like fun and entertainment and sort of escapism, right? Like rather than oil statistics and human rights abuses and whatever other things you might associate with those countries. Riyadh Air is on Roma at the moment. It's on loads of things. And, if you type Riyadh into Google News, you'll probably get all sorts of stories that maybe don't reflect that well on Saudi Arabia. But if you just flicking channels on a Sunday night and catch a bit of Serie A, it associates it with this part of the world that most of us for us is something fun, is something away from all that misery and difficult and complicated things on the news, which is why I think football is such a powerful tool for these autocratic states.
Yeah, it creates an element of compromise and sanitization, but also there's compromise through association and all the rest of it. I mean, other than that example of Schalke and Gazprom, which was something where I think you talk about some of the players that are associated with that, and obviously there's
Raul, of course,
Raul and the memories that the club have, and that you're buying into a part of history and the complications that come with that. How much of an impression did you get from people who are associated with clubs about their reflections on these associations that brands have with those parts of their history?
So I spoke to a couple of people in Schalke or used to work for Schalke anonymously, and I think they were quite embarrassed. I think they were quite ashamed because it's just such an extreme example, right? Like that company is now associated with the war in Ukraine, with Putin. I think most people in clubs don't think about it too much, don't want to think about it too much. That's not what they're sort of paid to do. There's a huge consciousness that if they were more scrupulous about sponsors, that would probably have a very direct impact on the pitch. I think it'd be naive to pretend it wouldn't. If you've got I don't know what Arsenal's deal with Emirates, 40-50 million a year, if they had a 10 million deal instead, that would mean they wouldn't have made one of the signings this summer potentially, and they'd be less likely to win the league as a result. I mean, it would be sort of churlish to pretend that this stuff doesn't matter on the pitch, because it absolutely does. And yeah, I remember when doing some reporting into cryptocurrency and Asian gambling sponsors, having off the record conversations with people in clubs, and they basically like a bit uncomfortable about it, but take the approach of if it's legal, which it was through loopholes, then we've done our job. That is certainly the approach that I encountered a lot.
Yeah, it's funny that point about performance in some of the places you went to. I think you talked to people in Serbia and some of these kind of second and third tier leagues, not to be too disparaging, but in certainly financial terms, leagues that are lower down the pecking order in European football. A generous sponsor can make a huge difference in terms of the performance of a club side.
Oh yeah, I mean the reason Red Star win the Serbian league every year is basically because of Gazprom, and it's like 5 or 10 million a year, I think, which is basically the same as one of the lowest teams in the Premier League. But there, it just blows everyone else out of the water. And Gazprom played a huge role in Schalke punching above their weight for years on end. I mean, they were really mismanaged and they couldn't really stop the rot when things went really wrong. But when that sponsor was pulled, they then got relegated. So it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, and yeah, it encourages maybe a slightly more phlegmatic relationship with some of these partners. But you know that 2 to 3 year association of clubs with their sponsors on the front of their shirts, it does create a different relationship between those brands and the clubs, and that's not really more amply demonstrated, I don't think, than in the how would you refer to them, these sort of shop front betting partners that have sprung up in the last 5 or 10 years in English football, where they have, you know, some presence in the Isle of Man or Jersey, but they're basically advertising to slightly grey area betting operators in other countries.
Well, yeah, it's something I've done a lot on, and they're advertising to people in China, but gambling companies are banned in China. So there's this sort of complicated, murky web of offshore companies that leads you to them being advertised in the Premier League. And the reason they're advertising in the Premier League is that someone in the corner of a bar or watching on a stream in China will see that advert, type in the Chinese characters to their phone and start betting on this completely unregulated sort of cowboy casino, which is really shady and murky and not what, you know, these British rooted companies should be doing.
Yeah, but that, I think it's interesting, and I want to get onto the implications of the changing betting regulations when it comes to front of shirt sponsors and what that might mean over the next few years. But you know, I think that really speaks to that. Sponsorship deals are done sometimes over a 1 year basis in Premier League football, particularly for clubs that you may or may not get promoted or relegated on a fairly regular basis. Whereas, as we've kind of covered, the shirt it's an internal part of the club, but also the history that you're selling is something you can't get back. If you win something or you have a memorable moment, that is always associated with that image of whatever is on the front of your shirt or on the sleeve. And if you create some kind of ethical or cultural compromise, then that's also what you're selling. Is that something that, again, you got any sense of people becoming aware of, or is it just something that's kind of priced into that particular partnership?
I really thought that when I went with Schalke. So they were on the front of those shirts for 15 years. And in that time, they won the German Cup. They heartbreakingly lost the Bundesliga on the last day of the season. I think that was 2007. And they got to the semi-finals of the Champions League in 2011, lost against Manchester United, who then lost to Barcelona. And for some people, that will have been like the greatest moments of their lives. They might have been with their best friends, with their relatives. They might be with relatives who are no longer with us now. And they might look back on those photos and be like, this is just the greatest thing that ever happened to me. When you're sitting around thinking, and it's, it's pretty hard to look back on that and think, oh, that logo, that was a bit dodgy. I'm not sure about that. Like, I don't really think that's how the football fan brain operates. So I think, you have to kind of bear that in mind when people are looking back over footballing memories, that it's just so deeply part of who we are and part of what, we spend our money on and spend our time on. That sort of berating people about sponsors, I don't think is particularly constructive. And it's also like the fans are not the ones that have chosen this. I mean, I think it's different. I think it's different when a state owns a club. I do think that is fundamentally different. But yeah, some of these Schalke fans, I felt a bit like, oh yeah, like obviously it's bad and you don't agree with Putin, but you're probably not going to burn all your souvenirs in your loft from your trip to, I think they beat Real Madrid. They beat some big teams in 2011. Yeah, so I think you've got to sort of be aware of that angle on it.
Yeah, but it's also an interesting kind of historical window when some of these partnerships happen. I mean, Gazprom, in Schalke's case, they had the cover as you go into some detail in the book of the energy relationship between Germany and Russia, which became part of the kind of strategic conditions that led to Putin gradually becoming more authoritarian. And that was not a gambit that was not the way that particular gambit was meant to unfold. It was meant to operate in the opposite direction as, kind of trade and economic relationships were designed in the 90s and 2000s. A slightly more benign example, I guess, is Parmalat. I mean, benign in the
quite bad.
The broader is still quite bad,
yeah.
but they Parmalat didn't invade any sovereign territories or bomb anyone. But again, that becomes like a little time capsule to a point where Parmalat's just a consumer brand and not associated with this catastrophic kind of fraud that takes down a huge part of a sector, and also kind of consequently the club itself in an indirect way. I found that a really interesting dimension as well.
Yeah, I mean, Parma the club and Parmalat the company were completely bound up together, owned by the same people. The surge of Parma in the 90s was because of Parmalat sponsorship. Also sponsored Palmeiras in Brazil. Sponsored Real Madrid briefly, and I think Boca Juniors when Maradona was there. So really had their sort of tentacles all over world football in the 80s. And the whole thing went kind of belly up spectacularly. I really like that example and Gazprom, because a lot of football fans will be familiar with those shirts without really knowing the sort of murky stories behind them.
Well, this is it, because the Parmalat scandal. So it's probably worth introducing to people who might have forgotten it. It was an accounting scandal kind of in the late 2000s.
Earlier, before that, it went belly up in 2000, I think, but it took years to play out. Yeah. The guy went to prison. It was. But
it was a fairly classic misrepresentation of earnings. Huge. Yeah, huge fraud.
Yeah,
basically,
I'm not an expert in accounting, but literally, like they said, there was 4 billion in a bank account, and there wasn't. It's basically the gist of it.
And it's the kind of thing that either if you were not around at that particular point in time and don't remember that particular scandal, or it's something that's kind of lost in the ether of Enron and global financial crashes and all the other many things that have happened since. It's curious to look back at those shirts and whoever might have been wearing them in the late 1990s, and then be taken to this incident, this kind of huge disruption in the Italian economy and in kind of farming economies in other parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, Buffon, Crespo, Cannavaro, Veron, so many big names.
Yeah, particularly as we'll get to with the kind of the industry in niche and nostalgic football shirts. Just on that point, we alluded to it there with the sort of the ghost gambling brands and all the rest of it. We are going to have a huge change in the Premier League in regulations where you won't be allowed to have betting sponsors on the front of first team shirts anymore. What do you anticipate that doing to the kind of the presentation or the language of English football shirts? I mean, I'm sure that betting money will find itself will work its way into English football in other ways, but
well, I think you'll get a lot of betting sleeve sponsors, because that's not banned. There'll be a lot of billboards still. And there's also a degree of like mutually beneficial disarmament. And this happened, I think, when cigarette companies were banned from F1 or various other times. There's been a ban like that. Is that these companies are basically competing against each other for market share. So if no one can advertise anymore, if they're not necessarily going for new customers as much as trying to get each other's customers, and it might not have that much of an impact at all. But yeah, it'll be a change, and I'll be really interested to see what the new sponsors will be, because there aren't loads of companies around with £10 million in quite a speculative and quite a hard to measure advertising budget. I mean, it's far from clear that it's always a good use of spending. I mean, TeamViewer, who sponsored Manchester United for 2 or 3 years quite recently, there's they're a relatively small company for some to be sponsoring that huge sum of cash. Their investors really kicked off and said, this is a massive waste of money. But people sort of get wrapped up in the glamour of it and can get a bit carried away, I think. It's inherently hard to value, right? Because if you have some guy walking around in Colombia wearing your shirt, that's not giving you any revenue, right? But it is kind of cool, and it's brand awareness.
Yeah, I mean, Chevrolet was the other one, wasn't it, with Man United, where they had that.
A massive
it wasn't so much the fact of the partnership; it was the scale of it, and yeah,
And that was
whether
a
that
period
made
that the team,
sense.
I think was that sort of just after Alex Ferguson left, so they were sky high at that point and got sort of progressively a bit worse every year. And these
Yeah.
guys in New York or wherever are kind of saying, "What's going on here?"
But do you think, like, is this slightly utopian thinking, or, I've seen murmurs of it from particularly kind of, I suppose, more the marketing side of football's kind of commercial sector than the hard money side. But the idea that this is an opportunity for some of these clubs to reclaim that space on the front of their shirt, not necessarily for themselves, but to think a little bit more in narrative terms or in cultural terms about who is going to appear in that space, given all the other things that we've talked about, given the associations that people have with, the Acorn shirt for Aston Villa or Crown Paints with Liverpool.
Yeah.
The organisations that are either more charitable or feel a little bit, a little bit cuddlier, as you said. Or do you think it's just going to be whichever is
The highest
the
bidder.
2026 equivalent of crypto and kind of has a lot of money that it needs to circulate in order to get itself talked about?
I'd be very surprised if we saw top Premier League clubs, putting charities on the front of shirts anytime soon. I mean, there was Nottingham Forest recently, but that was basically because they priced themselves out of getting a sponsor. So halfway through the season, they were like, "Oh, this will be good. We'll get the UNHCR refugee charity on there." I would be very surprised. I mean, it's quite hard to predict where the next rush will be. I'd imagine AI might be one. It's the big thing in the world right now, and there's a lot of companies popping up and a lot of companies that want to get their name out there. That could be it. But it's inherently kind of hard to predict because you're trying to predict the sort of world economy. Yeah, it might be nice if they put charities on that. I can't see it happening with the incredible pressure of financial rules at the moment, but who knows?
Yeah. I mean, the other facet of that, we've seen Chelsea go without shirt sponsors for a couple of years, or parts of the last couple of years, and they currently don't have one. Is that a little window into a club's thinking, do you think? Is that something that becomes a connection to how... Because Chelsea aren't alone. They're the highest profile example of a
They
club
won the Club World Cup without. I mean, that famous picture with Reece James and Cole Palmer and Donald Trump. There's no sponsors there, and that got shown around the world a lot of times. I think with Chelsea, it's similar to the Nottingham Forest situation. Of they have a price in their mind that's really, really high. In the same way, the Tottenham Stadium has never been named because they want a lot of money for it, and they're not willing to drop their price. Is what I think is going on with Chelsea.
Yeah, but it becomes an interesting commercial signal, right? It's either, well, in Chelsea's case, I think people will understand that there's going to be a price attached to that bit of real estate, but also, well, how do they do business? Are they particularly easy to deal with? Are they all these other kind of complicated signals that you're then putting out into the world? Yeah,
it's an interesting point, and I think also especially with these big clubs, a lot of the deals are really, really long. Manchester United's and Adidas, I think it was like 10 years long. So that's the way, those really big ones. So maybe Chelsea were like a year ago, we're doing really badly at the moment. We don't want to undersell ourselves. If we wait a year and they, things look like they're going pretty well for Chelsea on the pitch at the moment, that they could get one of these huge 10-year deals 6 months or a year down the line. I don't know, I'm speculating. But I think that is the thinking, that the really long-term deals are the way to go.
Yeah. Yeah. Another dimension we slightly alluded to, and it's again kind of pertinent in this example or in this facet of it, is counterfeit shirts. And you see this particularly with, again, you're less likely to see like a local market counterfeit. You're less likely to see kids in Brockwell Park up the road from where I live playing in counterfeit Liverpool or Manchester United or Arsenal or Crystal Palace shirts. You will see it, but
people order them online from China now. You can get that latest Liverpool shirt for 15 quid from China. And I think some of them are pretty good these days.
Yeah, so maybe that's just my eye letting me down. But the point I was going to make is that you might see the counterfeit Messi or Mbappe or whoever shirts, because that might be from a holiday, or it might be just easier to get hold of in this country or what have you, and it might carry less of the stigma of your mates saying you've bought a knockoff, whatever. The point I'm making is kind of less about that sort of playground culture thing and more like, what does that mean for the clubs and the sportswear brands? It's a slightly different calculation because that is money directly out of their pocket. But if you are associated with these clubs and if you are the sponsor whose logo has been faithfully recreated on a fake shirt.
Yeah.
What are some of the conversations that you've heard about that?
It's not think I've ever spoke to anyone who would know. I mean, I guess on the one hand, they're getting their name out there to more people. On the other hand, they would rather it done through the route of it costs £100 or whatever, and presumably they make something out of that. I mean, it's true. You can sort of see these the places where I went, like Colombia. A lot of those shirts are very clearly counterfeit, and it all feeds into this thing, which I have spoken to people about in football clubs of like, Chelsea have 100 million fans in West Africa. Manchester United are massive in Southern Africa in particular. Huge fan bases all over the world, but a lot of those fans you'll be getting literally zero in revenue from. They might be watching on a big shared TV that might be pirated. They might wear the shirt every day, but it might be a counterfeit. So it's quite an odd, if you watch, I don't know, your favorite TV series or listen to your favorite band, or they're probably getting some money from that somehow, whether that be through streaming or through YouTube revenue or whatever. Whereas football club, you can be like a diehard fan of an English football team on the other side of the world, and they get literally nothing from you in terms of money. So I think a lot of the people who work for these clubs are desperately trying to think, how do we make money from these fans? But it's hard to do.
Yeah. And I mean, coming back to the example you used of kind of India and the mobile internet, there will be some people watching official stuff. There'll be some people who are just interested in clips. There'll be some people who, it's quite hard to know the provenance of the material they're watching necessarily and what impact that has on the bottom line. But I guess it takes shirts back into the realm of being a means of communication as much as they are a piece of merchandise.
Yeah. And, a fashion of showing that you can afford it. There's all sorts of reasons to wear a football shirt.
Yeah, that takes us nicely onto kind of the next thing that I was keen to talk about, which, you, without giving too much away, you kind of, towards the end of the book, you visit Classic Football Shirts. Is it Classic Football Shirts?
Yeah.
Is that the name of the company?
Yeah.
Who are kind of the market leader in this country in vintage and unusual and, international shirts and all of that type of thing. How is the shape of the market, and also how is the meaning of a football shirt being changed by that tendency for it not just to be something that denotes an affiliation to a tribe anymore, but is something that's communicating something about who you are, what your interests are? Maybe it's just a kind of purely fashion-led thing that you're, wearing this Colo shirt from like 1994 or whatever it might be. What is that saying about where club football in particular is going?
I think there's more of a sense now that people want to be a bit different, want to be a bit niche, want to be a bit unusual. People don't just want to wear the latest big club shirts. And yeah, Classic Football Shirts, I visited there, while writing the book, and it's just outside Manchester on a sort of nondescript industrial estate. And there's just, I think they've got 1 million shirts in this warehouse, and you just walk down it, and it's like, you're trying to quickly work all these colours and trying to work out what it is, and lots of them are incredibly obscure. And there's a market for all that. People want to be obscure. If you go past any kind of five-a-side football cage in the UK, like I think 10, 20 years ago, it would have been all the big clubs you'd expect, and now you'll see niche ones. People want to kind of want to be asked about their shirt. What's that team? Where did you get that from? I think that's a real motivation for a lot of people now, including me. It's cool. I like it. Got my Goa FC shirt. Wear that in the gym. Why not?
Yeah, and it's regions, but it's also different eras and people wanting to, people wearing stuff from the mid-90s, especially at the moment, and you're seeing it as well.
Well, the mid-90s are kind of the birth of it all in terms of, if you go much further back than that, there weren't really a lot of replica shirts around. They did exist, but a lot of them were really kind of bad quality as well. So like they would just sort of fall apart in the wash. And there weren't many made, and there's very few sort of authentic kits from much older than the mid-90s, which of course when the Premier League and the TV deal came. But even in 92, like it took a while for the Premier League to become a big TV event and lots of games on TV and lots of money. And a stat I come back to a lot is that in the first year of the Premier League, there were only 13 foreign players.
Yeah.
And that changed so much by like 99, it really took off. So the mid-90s shirts, it's kind of almost as far back as it goes in terms of those really shirts that a lot of people were wearing.
Yeah, and you're seeing not just the appetite for those particular shirts, but you're also seeing the replication of particular styles and particular aesthetics in the shirts that are released now. I think there's a big kind of 2000s thing at the moment in a lot of the designs. I think Chelsea and Spurs both have shirts that are kind of almost the shirts they might have been wearing in like 2005 or 6 if they had the same kit sponsor. I'm not sure in either case.
Or is it like 2005? It's a long time ago now, right? Like it's 20 years ago, and if you're 18, that was before you were born. So I think it's easy to sort of think, oh, it's not that long ago, but actually, a lot of this stuff is marketed to people who are pretty young, and they're the sort of influencers and the tastemakers and the people who are probably sharing it the most on social media, not people who are older than that.
Yeah, but what do you think? Those two things combined, the fact that you've got every club in the world releasing, or every major club releasing 3 shirts, one of which is a bit of a free hit kind of style wise, and then you also have these kind of cyclical things and these more kind of fashion focused influences. What's that going to do you think, to the football shirt as a kind of cultural item?
I think the fashion, the idea of it looking good and looking good on like a catwalk is a really big thing now. And it fitting well and it looking different to last year's. And I just think they think about these things a lot more than they did, even 5 years ago. And a lot of thought, is huge. And you have like fancy designers. Is it Emporio Armani designed Napoli's last season? You've got the famous Venezia one. I keep seeing this Arsenal one that's like white. It's like the third kit. That it looks very sort of style. It looks like a sort of polo shirt type thing. I think that's a really big part of it now. I mean, the famous the England '96 shirt that Gareth Southgate misses penalty in was grey, and that was supposed to look good with jeans. Was the story?
That was the infamous, maybe that got smuggled into a press release or something. But
maybe that was like 20 years too early or 25. Yeah,
the other one I think of, because it recurs kind of every 2 years, is that was it just after 1990, the sort of blue like underwater effect one.
Oh yeah, I like that one.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean it's there'll be lots of different, I suppose, stories and communication that goes on through the buying and wearing of football shirts. You talk in your kind of preamble to the book about the first shirt you ever bought, which was a Villa shirt in kind of the late 90s, early 2000s.
2002-3 actually. So yeah.
Yeah. Are there any other football shirts that you own or bought or have worn or have seen that kind of tell another story about you and your?
I mean, the one I sort of covet but don't want to spend 200 quid on is the England '98 one, because again, just similarly, that's like the foundational football memory for me. Really annoyingly, Villa won the League Cup in '94 and '96, but I was just too young to remember it, so I've never seen my club or country win anything, unless the 2019 playoffs count, which I'm not sure they do. But yeah, one day I'll treat myself to maybe a Beckham 7 '98 World Cup with a little England flag on the collar, and that Michael Owen goal in St Etienne is just such a sort of core memory for me.
Yeah, I think I had that shirt when I was about 12, 13 I'd have been. Given my age away, let's just, before we move on from the book, were there any other shirts that you came close to including but didn't, or any stories that you
one of people have brought up to me a few times since is Visit Rwanda, which I've kind of mentioned in passing, but I didn't go into lots of detail. I think would have been interesting to go into in lots of detail. I mean, I'm kind of like, I'll literally like walk around the park and spot a football shirt and want to be like, oh, I could have included that. I mean, I just think there's so many stories all over the world that I could never have got into. You could write like 10 of these books with 10 different shirts. I'd like to have got to like East Asia, like, Vietnam, Thailand, place like that. I played, South Korea, Japan as a part of the world I didn't really cover. There's just so much there, like, so many stories behind football shirts I didn't get close to.
Yeah, maybe another volume.
Yeah, maybe. Let's see about that.
I mean, professionally, you and the book is, obviously it is fairly dense in the slightly harder edged side of football's impact and its relationship with the world that it exists in. But that's kind of closer to the line that you actually walk. I mean, the shirt thing is an interesting hook to use. It's an interesting angle, but as you said at the start, this really grows out of your the space that you've occupied professionally, which is in that between sport and don't want to call it hard news, but between sport and kind of
news,
mainstream news and politics and all the rest of it. I mean, how do you feel like, is there a sense in which the era that a lot of the stories that you tell in the book are kind of reflective of those two worlds coming closer together? Or is that a little bit like, has there always been a sense of football being a part of politics and commerce and all the rest?
I think there's certain, of course there has been, but I just think now it's so different. It's so, you have states owning clubs. You have three major Middle East players owning top European clubs, and it's kind of unavoidable. Like PSG won the Champions League, which they had brilliant managers and brilliant players and deserved to, but fundamentally that was a huge thing for the state of Qatar, just as sponsoring Barcelona was and just as hosting the World Cup was. You've now got Saudi Arabia, you've now got the World Cup in the USA next year, which is a huge thing for like Donald Trump, and his son-in-law Kushner played a huge role in lobbying for it. I think these big questions of politics and current affairs are so much harder to disentangle from football now, and are pretty hard to avoid completely, which I just don't think was the case like 20 years ago. Of course, there was a bit of it, but it just wasn't on the same scale.
Yeah, and I mean, particularly when you talk about the Gulf states, how important is it to understand what they're trying to do with sport, to kind of, to work it the other way around? It's not just you're explaining football by incorporating these elements of realpolitik and how different industries that surround football move, but the other way around with some of these nation states, if you understand what they're trying to accomplish through their investment in football or through their investment in whether that's events or sponsorship or what have you, the nation building or the soft power projects that they have, do you feel like football's becoming
totally
a core component of understanding that?
And maybe it sounds a bit arcane, but what you said is exactly what I'm trying to do in terms of, I think there's a lot of people who are like, right, this is the football, we'll try and do the politics around it, or I'm almost trying to do the opposite of like explaining the politics and the history of the world with football as the device for that. And I think to take Qatar as an example, one of the reasons they host the World Cup is to be less likely to be invaded by Saudi Arabia at some point, which might happen in like 40 years because Saudi Arabia is bigger and stronger. But if you host not the massive US military base, but also become really famous for football and athletics and tennis and everything else, it probably makes people less likely to invade you, because there's constantly, athletes flying in and out. Lots of people have been there. Lots of people know people there. So it's a sort of security thing, I think, as much as anything.
China is another interesting lens on that, because you had this project in China, which, you talk about the associations with imploding industries and stuff. You've got Guangzhou Evergrande and an era of Chinese football that now is in the past in many respects. But, you had this sudden rush of interest in building Chinese football into something much bigger than it was, and building China as a football force. A lot of that kind of came from the center, from, as you explore in the book, Xi Jinping's history with the game as well. And a lot of it faded because it became too much of a short-term political cost, and also just really hard to do. To kind of, similarly with India, when you talk about talent ID, building a football culture in a country of over 1 billion people, where there are certain societal pressures that cut across it and all the rest of it. It becomes an interesting way of explaining how the Chinese state works, how it sets its priorities, where it can be thwarted, even though it kind of seems like this unstoppable machine kind of dictating events from the center. And also kind of smaller cultural nuance, or smaller sort of political nuance, in terms of how Li Tia was swept up in a corruption scandal and things like that.
And I think with China, a huge part of it is very personal. It's about President Xi, and he loves football and wanted his country to be really good at it, and then it kind of didn't work, and then he found it a bit embarrassing, and then everyone pulled out. But yeah, I think the thing about India, I think it's really interesting that football just keeps getting bigger, mass around the world, but it's the same, but more and more is concentrated in Western Europe, and the same teams keep winning the World Cup or whatever. There's no sign of that changing anytime soon. So even as football gets bigger and bigger and more globalized, it's very, very concentrated at the very elite level in a small number of countries.
Yeah. You now are as you've alluded to a couple of times, you're at the Times, you're a data journalist, and I've looked at a few of the things that you've done recently, and where it quite often will come from is you're exploring or mining a particular survey or a particular bit of data and kind of building stories from that. What led you into that, first of all?
Well, so I spent 3.5 years at The Athletic. Before that, I spent 3.5 years at the BBC, mainly covering politics. I've always been, had that background in more, I suppose, hard news or conventional news or politics. And I did lots of sort of fact-checking, reality check type things there. But then I also did a master's degree during COVID at Oxford University's Internet Institute. Did a lot of data work there, advanced statistics, all sorts of things. And I kind of wanted to do that in my journalism. So this job just came up at the Times, and I got it. So I'm straddling these two horses. Of one is very much, I'll be writing things on A-level results and child vaccines and speeding fines and anything, and then football. But I think the two kind of complement each other.
Yeah, but the thing that the story that kind of prompted this particular line of inquiry I saw was something about cousins, and obviously we're seeing there's fewer. We see headlines about the fertility rate, but kind of a second order effect of that is that kids have fewer cousins, and you go into some of the ramifications of that. But is there a similar stat or a similar piece of data that you have seen that you haven't maybe spun into a story yet around football or around sport?
So one thing I'm always obsessed with is attendances in football, and just how incredibly positive they are in England, which I think is, particularly when you do a job and you write a book like mine, it's easy to get very negative, frankly, and be like, oh, isn't it terrible, and all these dodgy countries and whatever else, which I try to avoid in the book. But there are things that are really bad, and it's good to say that. But I just think the story of attendances in English football is amazing and brilliant, and that just keeps growing. And the more that money piles into the Premier League, which has its downsides for sure, I think the more people are choosing instead or as well as to go to lower league football.
Yeah.
Lower league football is just totally booming. And I've just, shouldn't give away what I'm working on too much. But yeah, I have been looking a lot into trying to do a big thing about that, and just really low down the pyramid. Attendances are booming at the moment. It's also the UK doesn't feel in a great place right now in all sorts of measures. And lots of things are very much not booming, and football just feels like it is, which I think is really exciting.
Yeah. So that growth is obviously there have been some bigger stadiums built at the top end of English football, but basically that growth is happening at the lower ends of the pyramid and in non-league and lower tiers.
Yeah. And Premier League stadiums are full every week, which certainly wasn't true 15, 20 years ago. But yeah, right down to National League South, you get teams with thousands coming every week and paying money, and it's just a different product to the Premier League, right? You could a lot of people can maybe walk there instead of driving for 2 hours. People could drink next to the pitch if they want to, can go with their friends, bring their young kids along without paying loads of money. I think I go and watch Villa a lot, but it's annoying. And it didn't used to be this case when Villa were rubbish 5 years ago, but it's hard to sit next to your mates. And I'm sure at Arsenal or Liverpool, it's even harder. And that's a real kind of fundamental thing of why going to the football is fun, is sitting or standing next to the people you want to go with, and that's just really hard at the top now because tickets are so hard to come by. So I think lower league football can offer people something like community and sociable that the top of football, because it's so popular, struggles to now.
Yeah, I mean, just with your kind of politics head on, and I know that there were some press events held at non-league football stadiums in, I think it was at Labour made it kind of a feature of their campaign.
Well into it,
showing a kind of astuteness that maybe they haven't shown that many dimensions since politically. But just thinking about the energy that there is around some of these smaller clubs, most of which, because again, the other trend that we've seen in the last however many years is a concentration of top flight clubs in the biggest towns and cities. And, almost half the Premier League is London and the Northwest. And that ability of maybe these smaller clubs to reconnect or to connect up bits of communities and in areas where there has been a decline in other institutions. Is that a story that people are maybe missing?
I think it's huge. I mean, if you think about I don't know, 100 years ago, people might have belonged to their church. They might have been in the army, and that might have been a social thing. They might have gone to working men's club. Conservative and Labour clubs were massive, not even that long ago, 60, 70 years ago. You might have worked in a factory next to all your neighbours. You might have spoken to your neighbours. Well, there's all these wheels of socialisation that I think have gradually decayed in the UK and beyond. And I think football clubs in some towns is one of the few things really that is a fundamental, geographically rooted community.
Yeah. And there you go. Maybe we'll see that reflected as well in the trade in non-league and League Two football shirts in the years ahead, just to tie it back to the book. But before we go, there's 3 questions that we ask everybody on the podcast. The first one is, do you have an origin story or something that sparked your interest in sport?
See, I struggled with this one because with Villa, for me, it was just literally, I can't remember there being a time that I was not just being dragged to Villa Park, but it being a completely I have pictures of a teddy bear when I was a tiny baby with claret and blue knitted. So it's just, I've never really had a choice or never really thought about it. I mean, certainly a huge origin story was switching from politics. I was like 28 years old, but I was a political journalist at the BBC, moved to BuzzFeed, and then that imploded during COVID. And then I was sort of scrabbling around what to do. And then the former editor of The Athletic, Alex Kaleidoscope, just sent me a message out of the blue and was like, "Do you like football?" And I yes. And he sort of came up with this job of being an investigative reporter in football, which was amazing. And I wouldn't have written a book about it, and I wouldn't be doing this podcast if it wasn't for that. So that's certainly, an origin story when it comes to football in a professional sense rather than just being a fan.
Yeah, I don't know Alex, but at some point, if I do come across him, I might have to ask what he would have done if he'd said no.
Well, I'm sure it would have been fine. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of other good people. Yeah.
What's your favourite piece of sports storytelling?
Good question. Sunderland Till I Die is the answer to that. I was just talking to someone about that today, actually, who had never watched it, which surprised me. If people haven't watched it, the first series of it, the second, third series, I can take it or leave it. The first series, I think the best sports documentary ever made. Sunderland get relegated from the Premier League. They invite all the cameras in for what they think is going to be the glorious rise back. It is, in fact, everything that can possibly go wrong goes wrong. It is completely hapless, completely incompetent, and just totally compelling. I find those sports documentaries of elite teams, there's an Arsenal one, a Man City one, Tottenham one. I'm not interested in that. Sunderland going completely belly up. Apologies to any Sunderland fans listening, but it certainly put the team on the map. I just think it's the best thing ever. I've watched it, I think, twice, which I never do.
I think there's a new series where they do finally get that.
Yeah, I'm just not interested
that they
in
wanted.
Watching that, but maybe I should.
And of course, infamously, changed the course of Wrexham's future as well.
Of course,
indirectly.
I've never watched. I occasionally, I don't know. I occasionally meet people who have no interest in football, and sometimes they say, "Oh, but I've seen the Wrexham thing," seeking some common ground, and I'm like, I haven't seen any of it. I'm sorry. And then they say, "Oh, but I've seen Ted Lasso." And again, sorry, I've not seen a single episode.
Not really about football.
Well, I feel kind of rude, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I quite enjoyed some of Ted Lasso. I think it kind of outstayed its welcome a bit, although I know it's coming back. But I'd say Sunderland Till I Die, maybe a slightly earthier take on football and football clubs. What is a sports story you'd like to tell or see someone else tell outside of the one that we just talked about?
I think I love Test cricket. That's my other. I'm only interested in 2 sports. The other one is cricket. I literally actually just today bought tickets for. I always go to Edgbaston in Birmingham and got tickets for England Pakistan, which is almost exactly a year away.
Oh, wow.
But one thing I find is that I love it, and I was brought up on it, and as were lots of my friends. But it's quite a hard thing to get into, and I've got friends who kind of are curious about it. But so I think if there could be some sort of Drive to Survive, it's so exciting and so thrilling, and the series against India this summer was amazing, and the Ashes is coming up. So if there could be some sort of entry point, because I think it's quite a high bar to entry for people, and there's a lot of very obscure language and jargon and stuff, which I've just been totally pickled in it for my entire life. So I get that it's hard. So yeah, something about that I think could be really good for it because it's such an amazing thing, and it's struggling financially, and it's long and. Or it's threatened by the much shorter formats of the game that are easier for TV and whatever else.
Yeah, and it's one that rewards investment of time and over the short term and the long term. I'm like you. I can't remember when I discovered it. it's not a family sport for me. But it just sort of one day I was watching Test cricket in the summer holidays, which
Well,
maybe
you
also
done
explains
terrestrial
something.
TV.
Yeah, maybe explains something about the paths these different things take. But anyway, Joey, it's been a pleasure, and More Than a Game is out now wherever you get your books. But yeah, thanks very much for your time.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.
Outlines is an original production from 2640.